Okay, we are looking at your textbook online in MindTap. So I want to remind you that if you go into MindTap, I'll show you how to get there. If you go into MindTap and you click on the calendar, because what will show up first is this. If you click on the calendar, it'll bring up this week's work. Well, if you go to Chapter 6 reading, that will then bring up the textbook. Well, I was already on this page, so we're going to go there. But if you weren't on that page, it'd pop up a table of contents, and you could click on the section that says Formalizing a Confederation, and that'll take you to where you need to go. But what I want to make sure you do is read and reread the section over the Confederation, the Articles of Confederation, as well as the Constitution, because that's very important information that you will definitely be tested over and possibly pop tested over. So make sure you're aware of it. The Articles of Confederation was our first constitution. Now, a confederation is where the states retain a whole lot of power and the national government retains very little power. And that's what they wanted because they were afraid of a strong central government. After all, they were fighting a war against tyranny, or what they believed was tyranny. Tyranny is oppression from a strong central government or ruler. So they were trying to keep that from happening again. They felt like government that is closer to the people, like on the state and local level, is better and more responsive to the people and less likely to be a tyranny. And so they really created a government that was very strong in the states and very weak in the national government. The problem is it didn't work. In this particular consistent system of government, and you'll read about this and study it, but it had only one branch of government, and that's the legislative or lawmaking branch. They had one house of Congress. Each state got one vote in that one house of Congress. They were most laws that were going to be passed had to be either passed by a supermajority, that means far more than 50%, or a unanimous vote. So it was very difficult to get things passed. Okay. There was no executive branch, so there was no president to lead the country. Now, there was a president of the Congress, but he simply oversaw the congressional meetings. He was not a president in the sense of the term we think of. So we didn't have a president. We didn't have a judicial branch. Now, here were some weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. They could not collect taxes. So there was no way for them to raise money to do things the national government needed to do, like pay off war debts or build roads or form an army or a navy. And so they had to ask the states for money. Well, most of the states were unwilling to give money. They also could not coin or print money. Therefore, each state had to do their own if they were going to do it. So that caused a lot of problems. The national government could not regulate trade between the states or with other countries. So if they wanted to make a trade agreement with France, France would have to make an agreement with every state, not just with the country as a whole. Even the states would have to make their own trade agreements with each other. They could not borrow money. They could not amend the Articles of Confederation without unanimous approval. There were just tremendous problems with this particular form of government. They just really could not function well with that type of government. Let's see, we're going to skip over this section somewhat. Now, there were a couple of important laws that they managed to pass. One of those is this Ordinance of 1785 that you need to be familiar with. It outlined the procedures for surveying land. In other words, the way that they were going to, because if you look at this map, here were the original 13 states. Well, the Appalachian Mountains, as you can tell, go straight down this way. We also, in the Treaty of Paris that ended the Revolutionary War, got all this land here. So they had to determine how it was going to be laid out, how it was going to be, cities would be laid out, properties would be determined, and all that. So the Ordinance of 1785 outlined procedures for surveying the land so they could lay out towns and states and things like that. The most important law they managed to pass under the Articles of Confederation was the Northwest Ordinance. It defined a series of steps that the territories in this Northwest Territory, everything above the Ohio River and east of the Mississippi, so all this area right here, it outlined how they would become territories, then they would become states after that, and you wound up having 5 states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin, that came out of that thing. It also banned slavery in that territory. So you make sure you need to know that. Here's what it looks like more recently. But notice how it's laid out in grids. That was from the Ordinance of 1785. So make sure you are familiar with all of that. Let's see. Now, in addition to the problems that they had with the Articles of Confederation and were unable to do much of anything, there was one incident that kind of pushed it over the edge, and it was Shays' Rebellion, which you need to be familiar with it. But basically, Massachusetts decided they wanted to pay off their war debts early, and so they raised taxes very high and wanted and demanded that those taxes be paid in specie. Specie is simply gold or silver. Okay. Well, the farmers in Western Massachusetts were unable to do that. That put a burden on them. So a man named Daniel Shays in 1786 gathered together some farmers from Western Massachusetts, and they shut down 5 county courts, which is where they would have collected the taxes, and this became known as Shays' Rebellion. By January of 1787, they marched on the federal arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts. Now, an arsenal is a place where weapons and ammunition are stored. Well, as soon as the wealthier people in eastern Massachusetts, Boston, and that area, heard of what was going on, they were afraid. They thought, well, we don't need these poor farmers coming after us, so we need to do something to put it down. So they basically hired their own militia, who then arrived at the arsenal in Springfield before Shays and his men, and therefore they were able to beat back the rebels, and that basically put an end to the Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion really didn't accomplish much in the short term. They didn't really get much of their ways, but there were a couple of significant things that did happen. In the upcoming elections that were shortly after this, people who were sympathetic or who understood Shays' cause won seats in the state legislature. In fact, they won a majority and were able to roll back those taxes and get Daniel Shays pardoned. This also helped the people on the national level realize, hey, if we don't have a strong national government, we're not going to be able to put these kind of rebellions down, because Shays wasn't the only one. There were others around the country as well. And so this really began a push for a new constitution, something different. So you had two very important people, Alexander Hamilton and James Madison. Alexander Hamilton was originally born in the West Indies. Therefore, he was not a natural-born American, so he could never be president. And he might have been had he been born here, but he wasn't. But he was living in New York, and he represented New York. And then James Madison, of course, was from Virginia. James Madison came to be known as the father of the Constitution because of his work to get the Constitutional Convention to happen, and because of the fact that he kept such good records of the meetings and stuff like that. And so many of the ideas that were actually adopted were based in his ideas. One moment. Pardon me, I had a sneeze come on. So basically, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, after Shays' Rebellion and with the weaknesses of the Confederation, decided we need to do something about this. And so they wanted to call a constitutional convention, but they knew that most people would not ever, or at least that a significant number of people would not want to change the articles. They liked it the way it was. And so basically, they fooled people. They said, why don't we have a meeting? Every state send delegates, and we'll have a meeting, and we'll just see about revising the Articles of Confederation. When they got there in Philadelphia in 1787, they didn't just revise the articles. They actually completely got rid of it and started over and wrote what we have today as the Constitution. Now, I'm not going to go into detail, but you need to make sure you go into detail on the information about this. But you need to know what the Virginia plan was that was proposed by James Madison. It was a plan favored by large states, okay? And you also need to know what the New Jersey plan, which was put forth by the New Jersey delegates, which favored the smaller states. And then they eventually had what we know as the Great Compromise, which wound up giving us the government that we have. 3 branches of government. We have an executive branch with 1 president and a vice president who enforce the laws. We have a legislative branch, which is our Congress, which is made up of 2 houses. It's a bicameral legislature. Bicameral is a word you need to know. It means 2 houses in the legislature. The upper house, the Senate. Let me go back to the president for just a moment. The president is elected for 4-year terms by the Electoral College. In the Senate, which is the upper house of the legislature, they were originally chosen by state legislatures, and each state gets 2 of those. The Senate was meant to represent the states. Now we elect the senators by the popular vote in the states, not by the state legislature. That changed about 100 years ago. The senators are elected for 6-year terms, and each state gets 2. And then the House of Representatives, which is the lower house of the legislature, is represented for 2 years. It is elected for 2-year terms, and they are chosen based on population and popular vote. Okay, and then we also have the judicial branch, which is made up of the Supreme Court and any lower courts that would be established by Congress. The president appoints judges to the Supreme Court and the lower courts, and they are there for a lifetime. Their term is a lifetime, so they can either retire, die, or they can be impeached and removed, but that's only happened once. Okay. Once the president appoints a judge, then the Senate confirms that judge. You need to make sure you know that. Okay. And there are other things you need to make sure you know. You need to know about what the separation of powers are and checks and balances are, because there will be questions about those things. You need to understand what federalism is, so make sure you study and read about that, because there will be questions on that. You need to understand and know what the 3/5 clause was. That will have questions on that as well. Just make sure you read and study this section very well and that you're prepared for it. Now, there was also a struggle over ratification, in other words, approving it and getting it in place. The Federalists supported the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists were against it. They were afraid of a strong central government. And you need to make sure you know details about this. But basically, I'm just going to tell you this. They finally won enough Anti-Federalists over to ratify the Constitution by promising that there would be a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution. And so they were able to win enough over to win ratification. And eventually the Constitution was ratified. You need to know what the Federalist Papers are, which was a series of articles written by John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison under the pen name of Publius, and they published them in papers throughout the country, arguing about what the Constitution was, what it would do, and all of that. So you make sure you need to know about that as you're preparing for this next test. All right, if you have any questions, be sure to let me know, and I hope you have a good day.